to the front of the net. Puck work to the outside to Eklund. Howe back to Eklund again. Kerr sparring with Stevens in front. Eklund creeps behind. Out in front to Kerr. He scores! Tim Kerr and the Flyers are perfect on 5-on-3s. They are 3 for 3. Get their first power play goal of the night and tie the game.
Everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 150. Wow, 150 episodes of the O&B Puckcast. And just, again, want to take the time to say thank you to our listeners to get us to this point from 2017, the very beginning, up until now, coming through our, coming to the end of our 5th season of the O&B Puckcast. Thank you very much. The O&B Puckcast is brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com and, of course, Jim South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. 40 years of the best cheesesteaks and hoagies in the grandest Philadelphia tradition. You know you have to have one. And if you live down near Jim's, but you can't get there, don't worry. They use DoorDash, so we can get that delicious food right to your door. Remember, Jim South Street, 400 South Street in Philadelphia, PA. And with that, let's introduce our panel. First, we have Chef B. How are you?
Very good. Looking forward to getting into it with Shane a little bit. I loved his last show. Unfortunately, I wasn't there for it. So I can hear some great stuff tonight.
Fantastic. And of course, making an appearance that we all appreciate tonight, the great Dan Silver.
Hey guys, what's going on? I'm good. I'm excited for the show. Get some prospects talk in, and there's not much to talk about the rest of this season. So we'll see how these guys look for next season.
Yeah, I mean it's all about looking forward, and that's really the name of the episode. Flyers look forward. So, and before we introduce our esteemed guest, let me just a reminder that we're on 12 podcast platforms. We have a YouTube channel. You can follow the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck on Twitter, Facebook page. Hit that notification bell on YouTube and follow if you want to give us a 5-star rating. If we earn that, we really appreciate it. 150 episodes in, more now than ever. And without any further ado, from the NHL Network, an advisor to EA Sports and so many other things, the great Shane Malloy. How are you?
Hello, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on. I always appreciate it.
It's great. Really great to have you back. And we want to kind of expound on some of the concepts that you talked about in your last appearance. And we're going to talk about some young Flyers. I know right now at this point of the season, the Flyers just completed March. They went 5-9-1 for the month. And they're on track for roughly 65 points. So it's a rough year. And, you know, last night and the night before or the contrast, you know, it's Jekyll and Hyde with a very young team, but there's excitement. And Shane, that kind of leads me to where we're at right now, trying to look at some young players before we get into the application of some of your concepts with what the Flyers are today. And we want to go through a list of some players I think that people are very interested in, including two that just signed out of college, Noah Cates and Ronnie Attard. Maybe we could start there.
Well, sure. What I like about drafting and developing college players specifically is really the time that's afforded them to develop. It's one of the issues that we find in the CHL. Like, unless you are farther along than the majority of your peers, you're having to turn pro at 20. And in some cases, if you don't get a chance to watch the American Hockey League on a regular basis, it's a meat grinder. It is the second best league in the world. And it's like extremely tough. Physically, mentally, the 3-3s can really grind on you. You're playing against men, and these are people who have families who are trying to earn a living, trying to get back to the NHL. They could care less that you were a second-round pick or a first-round pick. Like, they don't care. They're not interested. Like, because everybody's thrown into the same big pool, so it doesn't really matter at that point. To the organization, it matters, obviously, but to the rest of the people in the American League, it doesn't. So what college hockey does for these prospects, it provides them more time to develop. So they become mature. When they're coming out, now, you're looking at guys that are 23 years of age each. They're not a 20-year-old. They're 23 coming into their first year pro. That's a significant advantage in terms of their mental and emotional development. So in Noah Cates' case, you're looking at, I think what everybody and all the fans are always wondering, that, the $1 million question is, what is he going to be? What he could be is what the real big answer is. And that's $1 million question. And if I look at him and I'm projecting him forward, is he a fourth line winger? Could he move up into that F9 role on a third line? And we're talking about traditional lines. Yeah. So is he somewhere in that range? That's where I would probably have him at best, is somewhere in that range. And that it could potentially be a valuable forward for you. You need to have guys like that. There's value in that. Not everybody's going to play in a top two line. It's really rare to play there and to find a player, develop him, and get him to that point. And then you look at the defenseman in Attard. What I sort of look at him as is a potential insulator type defenseman. So if you're looking at a guy like York, players like that the more modern rushing defensemen really need an insulator type of defenseman. The Rob Scuderis, the Ben Sherratts of the world. They need somebody who can be able to hold ground while they roam, because there's going to be times where they're going to make a decision and it's going to come back, and it's not going to be the right decision, and that's okay. You got to let those guys make those decisions and push the envelope. So that's where maybe what Attard could be. I'm not saying next year, but he could end up being that. Like, so if he ends up being a 5-6, but can be an insulator, great, because it's an entry-level contract. That's one of the things that sometimes we forget about the value of a player, particularly coming in, is that entry-level contract. Is that if that player can play reasonable minutes and provide some value on that contract, that changes what you can do and gives you some flexibility moving forward. That means, doesn't mean you have to get run off like a drunken sailor and spend all your cap dollars, but it provides you some leeway, and that's one of the things that you hear from GMs all the time is we don't have enough cap flexibility. Well, that's what these two players potentially could do for the Flyers. And will it be next year? Maybe. I would rather see them go to Lehigh and play until they prove that they, basically they come in and they steal a job. Because I don't think you should give young players the automatic position. I think you have to come in and earn it to a degree, and you got to take the job away. Doesn't mean you have to start on a fourth line if you're a skilled guy. Like, you never put Frost on a fourth line, of course, or you shouldn't. But that's what I mean in terms of that. So if you're looking at these two players, if Noah Cates turns into a fourth line player, don't be disappointed. If he turns into a third line player, great. If Attard's a number 5, great. If he turns into a number 6, that's still good. And that's pretty much where I have them. If people are hoping for more, I think your expectations are a little bit too high for both these players. But remember, if they play, those are NHL players. And that's massively valuable considering how many NHL players are actually in the world. So I think both of these players have some value. Just be patient with them and don't expect them to come into the lineup and blow your socks off. If they do, it's a bonus. It's gravy.
Gotcha, Chef.
Yeah, based on what you just said and what the financial position that the Flyers are in, it looks like that they possibly might have to start a lot of these ELCs starting next year, or they have a lot of deals to be made as well. But how realistic is it to see a lot of these kids? I mean, and we're talking. I guess this leads into the development of a player later on, and I'm sure that'll be for later on. But it's going to have an impact in this question. How many of them are going to play next year, or at the end of this year when it's a little more season, just because of the financial woes?
Yeah, Chef, you're cutting in and out.
Well, I think I understood what his question was. Yes. Yeah. I think, Chef, I understand what the question is. And I think the Flyers situation will become more flexible if they can move James Van Riemsdyk's contract, even if they have to eat some of it. But they're going to have to, if I look, that's $7 million on your cap. He's not a $7 million value player. That's what his cost is, but that's not what his value is. Doesn't mean that he won't have value to an NHL team, just not at $7 million. So if the Flyers have to eat some of that for cap flexibility for next year, I think you have to do that. And what that does is it reduces how many of these younger players you have to force into the lineup. And if you do have to bring in and play in Attard, and you have to play, Cates, and you have to give more time to Tippett and some other players that are younger, then that's a situation where you should insulate them with veterans on that line or on that pairing, because they're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. It's okay, but understand that's going to happen, so that you can insulate them through. Because once again, I say it almost every time on our show, is the NHL is not a developmental league. It's not. That's what the American Hockey League is for. And when you throw young players into the deep end of the pool too early, you end up ruining them. How many first-round picks have we seen get thrown into the NHL too early as 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds and have struggled mightily, or their career just never pans out? It happens a little bit too often for my liking, and that's really because of impatience. So it's going to be incumbent upon this management group to be patient with their younger players, and that's where you go out and hunt for bargain free agent signings. And I point to the Florida Panthers and what Bill Zito did. Look how many of their players that they picked up along the way, forwards and D, that were value. Look at the Anthony Duclairs and Mason Marchment. You go through those kind of players, Carter Verhaeghe. You got to go find those guys, because they're the ones that can insulate and let the prospects grow and still give you value for that contract. So this is where the management has to focus towards, you don't have to make big splashes. You got enough forwards on this group, in this group, to be fine. What you got to do is you got to find ways to complement them with reasonable contracts. And I've yet to see that yet with this group, but we're going to see what happens in the offseason.
Yeah. Dan?
Yeah, I think we're touching on a really important topic, which is you look at the Flyers cap situation, and even seeing that it's going to go up from $81.5 million this year to $82.5 million next year. If you look at the Flyers situation right now, if you look at the expiring contracts, they only have about $7.2 million in space. And with that $7.2 million, they need to have a backup goalie. They need to have third and fourth line right wingers. They need to have a third line center. They need to have an additional roster spot too. So you're looking at 5 roster spots that you got to fill with $7.2 million. And so it's exactly what Shane is talking about, where if you can get some of these kids on ELCs to fill those roles, that's what you're going to have to do. And the fact that Attard and Noah Cates are kind of older types of players is a little bit of an advantage there, that they're seasoned in college. And so hopefully they might be able to withstand, the rigors of the NHL season a little more. And the other key that Shane obviously touched on is JVR, because you look at the Flyers contracts and which ones they're going to be trying to move out. And JVR is not, far and away number one on the list. And some fans might say, oh, well, can't you just buy him out this summer? Well, the problem with buying out JVR is that if you buy him out, his $7 million cap hit for next year only drops to $4.3 million. And the following year, you'd still have to pay him $1.43 million or $1.33 million. So they're going to want to clear out more space than just $2.7 million next year off JVR's contract, especially if Fletcher wants to go after, who knows, Nazem Kadri, Johnny Gaudreau, whatever he wants to do. So the key, as Shane said, is really going to be how do they get rid of JVR? And is it worth it to package a pick like they did with Shane Gostisbehere to get $3.5 million of cap relief? And that's dangerous because this team is not very good right now. So do you really want to be giving away second and even third round picks to get teams to take someone when you're not even going to be that good next season, presumably? Of course, that's not the way they're looking at it. They think that they can turn this ship around pretty quickly. But it sort of illustrates the precarious situation that these guys are in. And as Shane said, how important it is that some of these guys on ELCs can perform. You know, one of the other good things is that guys like Frost and Tippett and Wade Allison, even though he hasn't really had much NHL time this year, all their contracts are up this year, and they're not going to command that much money. So you're probably going to be able to sign those guys at a pretty low rate, close to an ELC type of number. So that also helps. But any key to what Chuck Fletcher wants to do is going to be predicated on getting success from third, fourth line, maybe even a second line guy that's on an ELC.
And Dan, you made a really good point. And, you know, I heard some comments about, you know, aggressive retool. I'm not even sure exactly what that means. And for that matter, like, it's not something that I would say publicly if I was in a management position. Like, it's, you know, you learn the lessons from Sun Tzu, from the Art of War. Never declare to your enemies what your intentions are, ever. But also, because this is a public entity, you know, you've told all your fans what your intentions are. Now, if you don't go do that, then it's going to blow back on you again. Like, so that's what I don't understand. So if you're going into the off season, like this big game hunting, I don't understand. And I really like Nazem Kadri, but he's 30 years old on a body that plays hard. He plays a hard style of game. Sooner or later, that body's going to start breaking down, and it's going to start breaking down on the other side of 30. So are you interested in spending $6-7 million to go get Nazem Kadri as a 30-year-old? I think that is, in terms of like of understanding risk, I think that's a really high risk with a mid-level reward.
Well, I just look at Wayne Simmons.
Yeah, I mean, and I love Wayne Simmons too. These are two players that I would love to have on my team, but you have to understand what you're getting, because you don't pay for somebody's past results. Nazem's having a fantastic year, but there's no guarantee he's going to like duplicate that in Philly for the next 3 years. He's never done it before, and he's on a stacked team, not asking to carry a large amount of offensive weight. So he's producing against, not having to produce against a top pairing D consistently. So those are kind of things. Or, you know, Johnny Gaudreau. What are you going to have to pay Johnny Gaudreau? $9 million? What does that do to your like cap system? Like, how many players do you have to get rid of to go get him, to fit him under? Then how do you replace that depth? So then you end up like in a situation like Toronto's in, where they're so top heavy. Like, I don't think, from my perspective, that's the direction you should go in based on what's already on the roster. Like, it's unnecessary to put yourself in such a top heavy, precarious situation, particularly, and I think you could get away with it if you had a really strong prospect pool. We're talking top 5 in the league, and you had draft capital coming. Like, you had more draft capital. You could do that because you have the assets to move some things around and to be able to fill holes more effectively. The Philadelphia Flyers I don't think they're in that position to do that. From a strategic standpoint, if you look at their offseason strategy, I wouldn't be big game hunting at all. I would actually do exactly what the Florida Panthers have done, is fill those holes with value contracts. I would specifically target that middle pack to lower echelon player, not in terms of talent, but in terms of cost, because there's always going to be value there, because that's the economic cost value line, and really go hunting on purpose to find those type of players. I took a look at their roster today prior to coming on the show. So if you look at their top 9, arguably in any order, in a line, you could have like Farabee, Couturier, Atkinson, Konechny, Hayes, and Tippett, Lindbaum, Lawton, and Frost. It's a reasonably good top 9. It's not blow your mind away, but that's a pretty hard – that could be a hard team to play against if Tippett and Frost continue to develop and you give them an opportunity to play with responsible players that can help insulate them. Then you're only really trying to build together a fourth, should be more of a third line. And then your defense core, Provorov, Ellis, Sanheim, Ristolainen, barring health, of course, that's a solid top 4. And York in that third pairing role, which he should be, and then you have him on the power play. Then you got to go find an insulator for York. Like, you got to go find somebody who's more
Justin
reasonable. Well, yes, but younger version of that.
Younger version.
Yeah, you're looking at sort of like a Ben Sherratt type player, or, a Josh Manson type player. Because if you don't protect and insulate York, you're going to hurt his development as he continues to grow and become more confident. If you look, I use this as a perfect example, and I'm not saying York is this player, but remember when Drew Doughty came into the league and the LA Kings started to really start making a run and making long runs in the playoffs? Who was his defense partner? Rob Scuderi.
Yeah.
An insulator.
Yeah.
Right? So, and they brought him over to be that specifically. And Drew will tell you his best games were when he had Rob Scuderi there, because he never had to worry. And that's what York needs. Because he's an offensive defenseman, and they're so rare. Scarce in terms of scarcity, he's a really rare breed. There might only be 25 or 26 offensive defensemen in the league. So you got to protect him. But you can't put him in a top 4 role to defend. You got to put him in the third pairing hole to defend, and then give him offensive opportunities. So there's some roster movement that has to happen with this organization. And I'm just curious to see what they're going to do based on what they have in the system. Because they had opportunity. I don't know. There's a narrative that I have noticed in Philadelphia, and you guys are around it every day. So tell me if you think I'm wrong. But there was a narrative sort of floated around that what this management group inherited from Hextall and Chris Pryor wasn't good enough. In that, you look at the, 2000 sort of 15, 16, 17, 18 draft, those 4 years. It's been discussed that the evaluation wasn't good enough, and these players weren't good enough. But if I think and I go back, and I made some phone calls this morning just to confirm, maybe my memory I was losing my mind, or my memory was starting to fade because I'm getting older. And I asked around, I said, was my thoughts accurate? And from my situation, when my colleagues and I, or people around the league, or other scouts from other teams, we talked about the Philadelphia Flyers prospect pool at that time, that 15 to sort of 18 draft, everybody thought it was good to potentially great. Every one of them.
Yeah. I mean,
to a man.
Yeah.
And this is like scouts that work with other NHL teams. These are other analysts that follow the draft. And I primarily leaned on, of course, the other scouts from other teams, and it's anonymous, so I can't say their names, but all of them said it was good to potentially great. So my question is, what happened? Well, now barring obviously your second overall pick got hurt, and that potentially basically ruined his career for the most part, based on his potential. So that's kind of an anomaly. But what happened to the rest? What happened? Because, and I know Chuck, and we get along really well, but when Chuck came in on December 4th of 2018, the Rubstoff draft, they just turned 20. That's their first year pro. So what happened with the years subsequent? Like, what did they do in terms of development that this draft class, or these draft class of 4 years, were considered so good to potentially great that they didn't pull the assets out of it? They didn't develop them into the players they should have been, because Philadelphia should not be in this position if those players would have been developed better.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. Let me just answer the first question. When Chuck took over, the feeling was that, I think among the fans, they basically felt the way you did. That was the fan base's thought process. They thought that the problems were mainly on the pro side, and that the power kind of went to Ron Hextall's head in terms of how he was running the organization. And between the fact that they weren't winning and he wasn't helping on the pro side, that's where the problems really stem from. But in terms of what Chuck was in charge of taking over, if you look at his moves in for the 2019-20 season, they just speak to, hey, let's not mess up what Hextall did well. Let's just add pieces here and there and let the other players grow into what you are saying and what we agreed at the time was a good situation.
But that didn't happen.
But that didn't happen.
Those players, like, that's where the issues I see, if you're looking at this organization and you're going to do a root cause analysis, the issues I see were on the development side. Was in, why wasn't there an assistant general manager managing Lehigh Valley all this time,
right,
to oversee everything? Why wasn't there more than 2 people in player development for an entire NHL franchise? That doesn't make any sense. There should really be 6, and a management staff in Lehigh specifically for those players. And that wasn't done. So you left Lehigh like as this rudderless ship for the most part. And then if you look at the number of players and young prospects that had potential, the priority is to ensure that your coaching staff are development coaches. I mean, the people that actually, not just your development coaches, but the coaching staff, your head coach and your 2 assistant coaches have to have a background in development. And you have to explain to them that our priority is to get these players into the NHL. If you do that, we're going to help you get an NHL job, whether it's with us or someplace else. We'll go to bat for you. But this is the priority, is to develop the players. That didn't happen. Why it didn't happen and what they did, I don't understand. I know what happened, but I don't know how it happened. I don't know why it happened. I mean, why was the decision made not to have an assistant GM there? Why was the decision made not to have more assets and resources in player development when you had arguably one of the top 5 best pools of prospects in the NHL at that time that were collected by, Chris Pryor and his amateur staff? Like that, if I'm sitting down in a room with Dave Scott and the management group as an analyst, those are the questions I'm starting to ask. Is because if you don't ask those questions, how can you correct those problems moving forward? You can't just throw money on it, because that doesn't work. Like who are you hiring? Why are you hiring them? What is your processes? What are your KPIs? What are your communication strategy? How do you integrate your staff from the AHL staff and your scouting staff, your player development staff, your NHL staff? How do you integrate all that information to ensure, along with your sports psychologist, that your prospects develop? Because it is the number one key to success in the NHL is your draft and developing. It's great if you can trade well and you get some free agents. That's great too. Those are all supplementary. But in the salary cap world, it comes down to drafting and developing. And this management group was given a really strong group, exceptionally strong group of talent. I do actually recall, and Mick Kern was nice enough to remind me that when Chuck Fletcher was hired, my comment was they need to find out what Chris Pryor is drinking and buy him a case of it based on what they inherited. That was my comment. because I really thought that they were in a top 5 group of talent in terms of prospects. And I think this is one of the main reasons they are where they are.
Well, yeah, it's hard to argue. I was just looking at the Hockey News futures issue, and it traces a graph of where the Flyers, have gone down. But at that time you're referring to, they were like in the top 5, no question. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, this discussion is sort of like the bloomin' onion at Outback. I mean, there's so many layers to peel back and things to go through and a lot of sort of revisionist history. And I was one of the guys, writing detailed top 20 Flyers prospect list during the Hextall era and talking about how bright the future was going to be. And now, I've got the drafts right in front of me from 2018 down through 2014. And I think that one of the reasons that a lot of people felt very bullish was just the simple fact that, in 2015, they had 9 draft picks. In 2016, they had 10 draft picks. And in 2017, they had 9 draft picks. There's only 7 rounds. So one of the things Hextall did was that he amassed draft picks. Well, if you're going to amass a lot of draft picks, you're just going to have more players that people get excited about. Right.
Particularly in the first 3 rounds.
Right. Particularly in the first 3 rounds. And if you look at Hextall's first round picks, I think it's been okay. Right. Travis Sanheim was, has turned out to be a pretty good NHL player. Ivan Provorov and Travis Konechny are pretty good NHL players. German Rupsov is a bust. It happens. I don't think that a different development scheme was going to turn him into.
I will disagree with that.
Okay. That's fine.
I think development is 50% of the issue, or is an indicator. Like, I can't emphasize. The longer I'm in this industry, the more I emphasize development, and you just can't I've talked to players where they've been drafted by NHL teams, and they go, "Oh yeah, so how often do you talk to your guys?" I don't know. I haven't talked to them in a couple months. I haven't even talked to them. There's times where NHL teams haven't talked to their prospects for almost half a year. It happens. It's really and that's not. I'm just talking about talking to them. I'm not talking about any other form of development. Like Dan, I in the beginning when I first started, I was really more emphasized on the assessment side, but now I think it's really a 50-50 split.
So it certainly sounds like. And we talked about this the last time you were on, that the Flyers development is not where it needs to be, right? And so, but I think also we can probably agree that not all first round picks, if developed properly, are going to turn into stars. I feel like it's
you just have to get them to play. They have to play above 200 games in the NHL. If you say German Rupsov as a 22nd overall pick turns into a 3rd-line center in the NHL, that's a home run hit. It's a home run.
But that's not the Flyers' problem right now, because the Flyers have plenty of guys who could play at an acceptable level on the 3rd and 4th lines. So the Flyers' major problems right now, to me, is the lack of elite talent. And there were 2 chances that Ron Hextall had at getting elite talent here. And the first one's obvious. The first one was when we had the 2nd overall pick and he took Nolan Patrick. And it's been, well documented, including what Bobby Clark said, that, it sounds like there were scouts that wanted the Flyers to take Miro Heiskanen or Cale Makar, and both players are probably elite NHL players, and he took Nolan Patrick. To me, that's the single biggest error that he made. The other one...
Nolan Patrick if Nolan Patrick didn't have his injuries, he's at worst a 2nd-line center in the NHL. At worst.
Maybe, but I don't think that he's an elite talent. And the other one,
I'm going to have to and I'll also say, I can't tell you where I heard this from. It's off the record. But the commentary about the scouts wanted this player or these 2 players over Patrick is not accurate.
I mean, but that's fine. But also I also have friends who are national scouts who know guys who were in the room when the pick was made. Who were so it's all about kind of who you listen to, right? I mean, if Patrick wasn't hurt,
he's a number one center. Like,
I don't know if he has. I read articles before the draft of plenty of scouts questioning his work ethic.
Well, I mean, it's like, is this like? I'll also question of who wrote that.
Okay.
Because I have and I'm not dumping on the independents because obviously I have one who's my co-host on my radio show, but I have questions about their ability to do a proper assessment in that respect. Scouting's the hardest job in all of hockey, amateur scouting, the hardest. And you're projecting a 17, 18-year-old kid into a 23-year-old man. So I always take those assessments with a grain of salt. I can say from my personal standpoint, I thought at worst his floor was going to be a second line center. At top, he would be like out of the 32. There's not even 32 like number one centers, but let's say hypothetically, he'd be in the middle of the pack of that. So he wouldn't be in the top end, but he would be somewhere in the middle. Like he had that capability, and injuries at that time just can destroy you.
The year that Brandon won the WHL championship was probably my peak in terms of scouting because I was really into it at the time. I'd bought in the package. I watched almost every single Brandon Wheat Kings game that year, and the Flyers had Ivan Provorov at the time, so I was watching them for him. But I also couldn't help but notice Nolan Patrick, and this was the huge year that he had. And I remember watching him and saying, "Man, this kid's going to become an NHL stud, right?" So, clearly, even I could tell I'm not an NHL scout that there were some special things about him. Regardless, it just hasn't really worked out. And so my point was that this team's biggest failure right now is that they don't have elite talent. And whatever happened, they took Nolan Patrick. There were a couple guys taken right behind him, maybe three if you want to include Elias Pettersson, that have become elite NHL talents. And Hextall didn't take that risk. I mean, Steve Yzerman was panned by a lot of people for taking Moritz Seider, and he's turned into a kid who looks like he's an elite player. So it's
it's the injury factor, like Gilbert Brulé. Gilbert was an 8-year-old kid that got thrown into Columbus, shouldn't have been there, broke his sternum, was never the same, and then got injured again in the same year, was never the same player ever again. I watched Gilbert since he was 15, all the way through the dub. And there are times that you cannot afford to have catastrophic injuries in your development window. That 18 to 22 window, you can't have it. And you just don't recover. Olli Juolevi, 5th overall by Vancouver. Now, I wouldn't have picked him there. Would I picked him 10 spots later? Sure. At 15, I'm okay with that. But not at 5. And he should have been a number 3 D-man. And catastrophic knee injuries, never recovered. And it happens. And it's just unfortunate. It happened to be the 2nd overall pick and happened to be a big, strong centerman that would really have solidified the Flyers' future. And it blew up in their face because of really unfortunate injuries that there's no way anybody could have predicted this. I mean, this was a really, I think a singular, single-digit percentile chance of that happening. But it did, and that's probability. And I can't blame Hextall and Pryor for going to want to take a 6'2", 6'3" centerman that can play at his level. I don't blame him. Nobody did. It was just unfortunate that it happened. They were just unlucky. And it's put the franchise back. And were the players below, have turned out great? Well, so they should, because they're top 10 picks. They better all make it, right? They better all make it. So that's my point is, I don't defend everything Hextall has done, because there's some things that I liked he did and some things I didn't. But certainly, I can't blame them and dump on them for Nolan Patrick. That was just it's a fluke. He could be walking down the street, gets hit by a car, end of his career. It's that kind of fluke of injury. No one could have foreseen that happening. That could easily happen to Pettersson or Heiskanen. They easily could have got injured and never played again.
Except, and this is the last thing I'll say on Nolan Patrick, I wrote an article before the draft detailing all of the injuries that Nolan Patrick had leading up to the draft. And to me, I only found one comparable with the number of injuries that Nolan Patrick had going in the top 2 overall, and it was Patrick Stefan. And we know how that one turned out. So
that was concussion.
I know.
Yeah.
But I think that there was a decent amount of injury history there, and that I think that perhaps Ron Hextall, because of his history with the Brandon Wheat Kings, maybe didn't dig enough into some things that maybe he should have.
There's a risk assessment there with any player, right? And that's understandable. And could he have mitigated that risk? Sure. And that's a matter of maybe you don't bring him into the NHL right away as well. Like you, and that's
that always felt that way. Yeah,
and that's the thing is that it's one of the things that I talk to the guys a lot about is, and it's part of a narrative that gets built out. It's like, oh, well, he's a top 5 pick, so he's got to play in the NHL next year. No, like you don't even have to. Your first round pick doesn't have to play in the NHL right away. It's not a guarantee, and it shouldn't be. You shouldn't have to throw your top 3 pick into the deep end of the pool and hope he swims. Oh, hey, by the way, here's an anchor. Let's chuck that in here too, because the team he's going to isn't very good, obviously, or they would have been taking him there. So, I mean, unless you win the lottery in some cases, that's, you jump up 10 spots and you get that player. So, there's that. And again, I completely I understand the position that you're coming from. And there's a lot of things that I saw in him too, as well, where I thought, okay, well, this is something they're going to have to mitigate. They're going to have to keep an eye on it. And that's where your player development staff and, your training staff has to keep an eye on that. And would he be better off not being in the NHL next year? And that's the risk that sometimes happens. And now they're in that position partially because of unfortunate, but also partially because some bad player development. It just, I think it exasperated the situation from your guys' perspective. Not only did they not develop their players very well from 15 to 18, but then Nolan Patrick, doesn't work out. Would the thoughts of the Flyers be different if he was a second line center right now? You probably wouldn't even have had to sign Kevin Hayes and spend that $7 million. You could have spent it someplace else, or spread that money around a little bit, and you would have had greater depth. I mean,
well, let me ask you, Shane, because there are one of the things we talk about, we need more scoring wingers, and the Flyers do have a couple younger guys that are in that mold. One who has played about 100 NHL games in Owen Tippett, and another one who's a somewhat similar player, it would seem, in Ty Forster. And I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about these players as, we move along and look at, some of these other guys.
Well, in terms of Tippett, one of the things I've noticed, I made a point of watching more Philadelphia games with Tippett there, and I find he's been telegraphing a little bit too often. And he's a player who needs somebody who's a natural playmaker, and none of their centers are natural playmakers. None of them. Couturier is not a natural playmaker, although he can make really good plays. He's not a playmaker is in terms of a Barzal type of playmaker or somebody or like a Zegers who can make those type of passes. Tippett is more valuable when he has that type of player on, whether on his wing or a center, somebody who can feed him those kind of pucks. I was talking to a player development person a couple that I know, and we kind of looked at Tippett's game and broke it down, and their thoughts were that he may have to in the offseason go back and change some of his shooting mechanics to get the puck away faster, but also be able to change his angles more effectively, and just to work on some finer, more micro details that he can work on as he gets into it, because the kid can hammer the puck. He has the capability of being a 30-goal scorer. So it's there. So it's a matter of, I think he just needs to have a strong offseason and work on those things specifically. But then the Flyers have to match him up with somebody on that wing who can pass him the puck, because I don't think it's going to happen to center. Now,
is Morgan Frost, is he good enough?
I was just going to say his name. He's the one playmaker. I know Frost plays obviously center, but I think he might be better off on the wing specifically for the next year and maybe the next 2 years, because they really, like with Couturier and Hayes and Lawton, you're good down the middle. Like if you want to play all three of those guys down the middle, you're fine. Big, strong, like they can defend. They're not exactly the playmakers, but the playmakers could come from the wall. It's okay that your playmakers come from the wall. It just strategically, it's a little bit different than a prototypical team. So you could have Frost feeding Tippett. If you're going to do that, that centerman has to be one of your best defensive centers that can play in a top two line.
Would that be Farabee? Could Farabee be that?
No, I would probably have to put Couturier there.
Okay.
And like I think you're going to have. I don't know if Hayes has the discipline to do that or not with two younger players. I don't necessarily would want to put two younger players together like that. But if you're going to do that with a center, it'd have to be Couturier. Then the concern is defensively, right? Like Couturier is going to have to carry a heavier load with those two players from that standpoint. And I don't think they should actually get, like, I heard there's some talk about maybe trading Konechny. I don't think you need to do any of that. Like I listed off the 9 forwards that I thought could play in their top 9. And I don't even think they really need to go out and like make a big splash. If I was in their position, I'd be more interested in trying to find bona fide, really good third line forwards. So your fourth line isn't your prototypical fourth line anymore. Make it another third line. Go get guys that will make you $2.5 million, $3 million a year, and then have another really strong third line. So you have like, say, Lawton and Lindbaum, and maybe you have Frost on that line, but then you have another line similar to that, where maybe Cates is that entry-level contract, and you go get 2 more guys that are similar to Lawton and Lindbaum at a similar contract. And that's what you could do that if you move JVR out.
Yeah, my question is, you see all the people, I see a lot of them, especially on Twitter. They're one of their big complaints is that Oscar Lindbaum is dying on the fourth line. Now, based upon your previous stuff that you've said on the show and all that about spreading your meat over 4 full lines, I mean, if it works out and you can actually do that, I mean, this is how you justify an Oscar Lindbaum or somebody with that better than fourth line talent managing on a fourth line and still being productive. Is that correct?
Because that's no longer a fourth line.
Yeah, you have Patrick Brown and Zach McEwen.
Right. So what you have is 2 third lines. So like McEwen and Brown basically are your 13th and 14th forwards. See you later. Right?
Yeah.
You're not good enough to play on a third line. Like it's breaking the mold and potentially the dogma. Like when you're of the traditional 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. Because the salary cap era has changed everything. Now it's about what is the cost of a player, what's the value of a player, and how do you change your roster construction to fulfill that. And if you're looking at it like so if we're sort of summarizing back what I had talked about in the previous show, is that when you have a limited amount of cap dollars, what is the most optimal way to build your roster? And people talk about the Philadelphia Flyers need more elite talent. Well, how do you get that? You either get it in the top end of the draft, or you pay a king's ransom in free agency to pay for it. And that's $9-10 million a year. And then you have to have 3 players on your fourth line at entry-level contracts that are like replacement level or worse players to make up for that. Or you make a catastrophically massive trade. And I point to Chicago and what they paid for Seth Jones. Yeah. Like that was a massive amount of assets. And as much as I like Seth Jones, I wouldn't have made that trade.
Yeah.
Right? Because what you end up doing is you're so top heavy. Right. And you're forced to play those guys that many minutes. If you look at like how Philadelphia is constructed, and many of their top players have had some injuries, why not reduce some of that load of their ice time load? So if you had 2 second lines and 2 third lines, so if you have, say, Farabee, and I'm just throwing these lines out, so don't text me or message me and yell at me for it. This is hypothetical. So you had Farabee, Couturier, Atkinson, and Konechny, Hayes, and Tippett. Those are your top lines. And say against the peer group of the NHL, they're both good second lines. Okay, nothing wrong with that. But then what do you do with the other two lines? Then you take the money you would spend going after Gaudreau or a Nazem, and you make another third line that's equally as strong as Lindblom and Lawton and, say, Frost on a third line. Something that's equal to that. So that when you put players out and put lines out, particularly on the road, there's no disadvantage. Like, you're not having to insulate a fourth line. You're not scared to play them. They're 15 minutes because they're a legitimate third line, a good third line. So you're looking at, the Casey Cizikas of the worlds, those kind of players. Forget the whole, I used to always give it to Alain Vigneault because his goal was to build the ultimate fourth line. I'm like, why? My question was why? Why can't you have two third lines? And he's like, that. And we used to talk about that. I'd see him every once in a while, like when I was in Vancouver, and just construct your roster a little bit differently. And I think Philadelphia is in a position to be able to do that at this time.
Well, that's the question, Shane, because they do have a lot of younger talent that is in that kind of mid-6 range.
Yes.
And they have cap problems. But here's the one stick in the mud for me. One of their big issues is on special teams. And how do you solve their lack of dynamic presence on the power play? Is that just coaching? Do they have the personnel? Because it's one of the worst, if not the worst, power play in the league. And, of course, PK to me is more coaching and effort. But the power play in particular, it's the worst I think I've ever seen in the history of the Flyers.
Well, I look at some of the names. I'm like, Farabee's talented. Konechny's talented. Couturier, Hayes, when they're healthy, they're Atkinson, Tippett, Frost. That's 7 forwards that could be on a power play in the NHL and be good. You don't have to be great, but good. And now that they finally, other than, Provorov and then having York is going to make that power play better. But I think they have enough to be a good power play. What I'm talking about is you just have to be good at everything and just be able to roll your lines effectively. So you have a good power play, but maybe it's not a great. You potentially with this system actually have a great penalty kill because you have players that are more akin to penalty killing. And particularly if you get an insulator defenseman for York. So there is ways to construct this roster because you can't start from scratch, unfortunately. So you do have some players that are in the $7 million range that you're going to have to deal with, but they're not $10 million players. You haven't pigeonholed yourself to a point where you're like, we got 3 guys at 10 million or 9 million. What are we going to do? We can't, we have issues in terms of our budget. So we need to have 4 players on entry level contracts on our roster, which doesn't help when you get into the playoffs because those players always get exposed.
So if you're a fan and you're listening to what you're saying, and all of a sudden the Flyers have hired you as an advisor, I mean, the idea, I guess, part of what I want to do, I do want to go through a couple more of the kids because we want to get your sharp eye and your opinion on them. But the thing is, they appear like my current position is that I want them to step back for a couple of years, stop spending money, let some of these kids play together in the AHL if they're not ready, get some camaraderie going there, like Tampa has done with so many of their prospects and other organizations.
You want to take Syracuse and Hershey and Ontario, LA's farm system, and you want to replicate that.
Right. And then in the interim, go for some of these other, like Carter Verhaeghe and some of these other moves like you were talking about, and just let it happen. Collect draft capital, assets, let your kids develop, and stop raising expectations and come into reality. Well,
I see your point. So if we're looking at, we'll look at it from the prospect standpoint. So I think Frost is should be ready to play that in that role next year. And you have Ratcliffe, maybe Cates, Wade Allison, does he need more time? Yeah. Teno Lashinsky's in the minors as well. Like, what I would want to see is the players that are left over from the 2016, 2017, now the 2018 and the 2019 to populate Lehigh Valley. So Jay O'Brien, Adam Ginning, Jack St. Ivy, if you're going to sign him, Wiley, Samuel Urson's there, Zamula, who wasn't drafted but was picked up. That's good pickup. Nice signing. You add Bobby Brink to it, Ronnie Attard. You leave those kids in there for a couple of years, and you specifically increase your player development department to 6 people, 2 player development for Lehigh only, and hire an assistant general manager to manage Lehigh. Go find somebody who is not currently an assistant GM who has experience in that area so that they can oversee the development of their players, hire more skills coaches. So if you want to invest money, you want to spend money, don't spend it on players, spend it on staff for your prospects in Lehigh. Because think about the return on investment that we talk about. That's a much greater return on investment than going to sign a 30-year-old free agent for a 6-year contract at $8 million a year, and 3 years into it, they're an albatross contract that you're trying to get out of. And you're right back at square one again. It's just unnecessary to chase those free agents. I think where Philadelphia is, if you look at their roster, I just think it's completely and utterly unnecessary. I think part of their issues of them, why they're so bad, is injuries. Like, they've had some pretty catastrophic injuries to some really critical players. Do I say they'd be in the playoffs in the East? Probably not, but they could certainly be fighting for the last wild card spot. They had enough talent. They have a good goalie. They had a reasonably strong defense, top 4. They had enough pieces to make a run. This roster isn't terrible. It's just what I'm interested in is what are the next steps? What do they do now? Because you can't change what happened. You get we can talk revisionist history, but in the end of the day, you have to review it and analyze it so you don't repeat the same mistakes. But what are you going to do moving forward? How do you get the most amount of value? And it's really going to be about developing those players and spending money to develop them. And then on the NHL roster, it's really about let's just find complementary pieces and not blow our budget and try to blow out people to try to get that one player that they think is going to make the difference, because they almost never do. Look at past, 10 and I could probably go on a tangent about the failures of free agent signings, and how much money you spend and how ridiculous it ends up not working out and how rare that is. I remember seeing a study. I don't remember who wrote it, so unfortunately I can't give them credit, but they said their average was between 20 and 22% of every free agent signing provided the value that they paid for. And the other 78 to 80% did not provide the value. So I don't see big game hunting for the Flyers, I think, is a no-no. And what I don't understand is, and I haven't had a chance to ask Chuck about that, but why would you publicly state what your strategy is? Why would you say we're going to do an aggressive retool or aggressive, whatever the term they used? It was aggressive. Never, I would never, ever state what my intentions are.
Well, I can tell you why. Let me tell you why. They've had 3 bad seasons out of 4, and they had a teaser season in 20, and they've had a decade of futility, and the fans in this town are not used to that, and that's what this is really all.
But you still don't have to don't tell your enemies what you're doing. The other 31 teams are not your friends; they're your enemies, and they're going to find a way to throw boat anchors at you. Because what that says to me is that's Chuck's and their strategy. Well, let's see how can I, as a general manager of another team, manipulate that situation to my favor. They're under coercive pressures, not only from the obviously the ownership group, the owners and the fans and the media. There's a lot of coercive pressures, normative pressures. So let's find a way to see if I can help Chuck out. Hey, Chuck, phone him up. We're going to find a way. I'm going to help you out, and you're going to help me. But that's not the GM's intention. It's just simply, these are basic strategic rules that if you haven't learned from Sun Tzu and you haven't read The Art of War, please read it, because it's critical.
I don't think Chuck Fletcher's a Sun Tzu guy. I think you've hit on something that, Chuck Fletcher seems like a nice guy, an honest guy, maybe too honest though for that job, right? I mean, he really does, I think I was happy that he, with the whole Giroux thing, and it sort of came out that it sounds like that Giroux had wanted some kind of assurances he was going to come back. I was kind of pleased to read that Chuck basically said, no, we can't give you that assurance. You know what I mean? That was, to me, that was sort of like a Chuck Fletcher, being a tough guy, which he needs to do a little bit more, I think.
Well, I mean, that's strategically, that makes the most sense. You can't give him assurance to come back. You can't, because you have to really go into the offseason and look at this optimally. And what would Claude Giroux want? I want another $8 million a year. Well, I can't give that to you to a mid-30s player, as good as you are and as much as you mean to the franchise. You can't do that. That is a bad decision. And I really, really admire Claude Giroux as a player. I would want him on my team instantly. But based on his age and where his production is eventually going to go, you can't do that unless you're going to give me 1-year deals. We'll do 1-year deals until the wheels fall off. If you want to come back to Philly, we're going to have to do it at $6 million a year and give you a couple of years, and we'll do it a year by year basis. It's probably not what he'd want to hear, but that's what you'd have to do as a manager. You just can't put yourself in that situation to pay him any more than that. As valuable he is to the team, it's too risky to do that. And you have too many players on your roster that have injury issues.
Yeah. Chef?
You talked about an AGM to run, basically the Phantoms and develop those players. We've seen these, hirings, and I wasn't around for the last time you were on, so maybe you did touch on it a bit, but Danny Briere, I guess, being hired, and you have a couple of these analysts being hired as well. Is there a chance that they're going to actually delve into that part and maybe actually get some people that can help develop this younger talent that they have? Or, and if so, I mean, we all know what Danny Briere's role is stated to be. What do you actually think Danny Briere's role is?
That's a good question about Danny Briere. When he was going to be hired, and I heard it was coming, I thought it was going to be assistant GM to run Lehigh. Yeah. That's what I thought his role was going to be, and that he was going to insulate himself and bring in some more people for player development and ensure that he could do that job properly. Now, I think he can do that job. I think his experience in Maine has set himself up to do that specifically. And from not being far away from being a player, he has an understanding of what the needs of the players are from a skill development standpoint, from a biometric standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, what their needs are, and to bring in the personnel to help them so you can nurture these players along. We keep forgetting a lot of them are, when they get into the American League, they're 20 and 21 years old. Remember what we were like when we were that age? Basically, I was a hairless monkey, right? So they need some help. And I thought he would have been the perfect person. And then when that wasn't his assigned role, I was a little bit surprised because it just sort of made logical sense for him to do that. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to happen in the offseason or not, but they're certainly going to need somebody to manage that, because I think it's impossible for a general manager to manage both teams. I think it's irresponsible to do so, because you don't have enough time and bandwidth to be able to do that, even if it is in the same city or it's 2 hours away like Lehigh is from Philadelphia. you need somebody with boots on the ground specifically to monitor those situations, and have people to help support that properly. So Chuck, as the general manager, can act as a CEO instead of a manager, because that's really what a general manager is in the NHL. Like, they're supposed to see the macro strategy, and then you have all your managers and directors underneath you to make that happen. Then you have those micro discussions about strategy and strategic communication flow and what is happening, and you build out really robust player profiles so that you can take a look at what the player is and where you want him to be based on who that player is, because you can't make everybody the same skater as Connor McDavid, but how can you make him the best version of himself? And you got to have some staff around there to support that. And it can't always be token hires of former players of that organization. And Philadelphia is not the only one that has done that. Other organizations done in the past. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So I think they, as an organization, really, this is a great opportunity through the rest, the 15 games and into the offseason of like, okay, let's analyze everything. Like, let's strip this thing down right down to the frame and do some, really strong risk analysis and root cause analysis of what happened, so we don't repeat this again. And treat hockey operations like an operations department of a Fortune 500 company.
Right.
Okay.
Because that's what it is.
That you've had. Yeah. No
Yeah.
doubt.
With that being said, I'm sorry, real fast then. With that being said, now, do you think that, like you said, that possibly it could still happen? You think that they're just at this point waiting to the end of the season for the Phantoms is most likely? Could that be the delay and possibly Briere going to run the structure of that team, or is it just not been decided, or is that something that could go straight still?
That's a good question, Chef. It could go either way. I don't know yet. I think it's a logical choice to do so, and then because I think Chuck needs to have more management staff around him. Because if you looked at organizations that have had problems, the majority of them have been really short-staffed. I look at Vancouver Canucks recently when Jim Benning was running it. He had essentially one assistant general manager. And then Ryan Johnson, sort of managing and doing player development in Utica at that time before they moved the franchise to Abbotsford. He was grossly understaffed, did not have a director of player personnel as well. So those are the kind of things that you don't want the Philadelphia Flyers to become, because it's too much work for one person or two people. Like, you just need a much more robust staff. And I thought when I was like mapping out organizational charts, you could have 3 assistant general managers. In some cases, you might even be able to have 4, depending depending how many directors you have. And then you should have a strong R&D department, not an analytics department. I wish people would stop using that term. It's antiquated. It's inaccurate. Like, analytics is a valuable tool, but it's a singular mathematical discipline, right? And so there's other disciplines involved in that. You should have a really diverse R&D department, no different than a Fortune 500 company. It's not like Philadelphia can't afford it. And what's the R&D of that? Like, what's the return on investment for an R&D? What do you want to spend? You want to put $1 million budget on that? That may sound like a lot of money, but that's not even a fourth-line player in the NHL.
No,
that's nothing. That's nothing.
There's no cap. There's no doubt about it.
There's no cap. There's no cap for that. So what's the return on investment? What do you want? You want 2-1, 3-1, 5-1? I could get 5 people hired to the Philadelphia Flyers within less than a week that'll make $200,000 a piece, and they'll give you a 3-1 minimum return on investment.
Yeah.
And they come from diverse backgrounds, but it's about thinking how you run your organization differently than what has been happened in the past. I think hockey has been caught by dogma for a long enough time, and it's part of our culture. We follow the same what everybody else has done, and sometimes to our detriment. Like, if you guys have ever seen Diffusion of innovations. It's a theory based on the introduction of ideas and products into society. Hockey is far to the right. Like, we are late majority. We're not laggards, but we're certainly late majority. And you got to swing it farther to the left. And that's where an R&D department could help the Philadelphia Flyers. It's about providing more data and more information and be able to have it in a practical, pragmatic setting so managers can make decisions quicker and easier and have more information and to know what the other teams are doing. I think Philadelphia, actually, if I was a fan, there is some opportunity here. Like, they're not as bad as you think they are. They have more prospects than you think they do. It's not great. I think they've really, unfortunately, wasted a lot of prospects. But that 2018 draft, 2019 draft, that's not a waste yet. Like, Jay O'Brien could turn into a player for you. Adam Jennings could be that insulator for you. Like, there's some possibilities in that draft class and that 2019 draft class. So it's not all for nothing.
Let me ask you about a couple of them, because if people are going to kill us if we don't talk about some of these guys before we wrap up. Ty Forster, to me, it was a different kind of pick for them. What do you think, or what do you know about the player, and what's your impression?
What I like about Ty is he's ultra competitive, and he likes to play inside the dots. He's a guy who's going to play on the inside of the ice, and that's what I like about him probably the most of all the prospects for me. And it's really just as long as he's got to stay healthy. As long as he stays healthy, I think he's a playoff style player. And that's one of the reasons why I think Philadelphia drafted him. Is there's certain players that'll get you to the playoffs, and there's certain players that'll help you win in the playoffs. And I think if he stays healthy, he'll be a valuable asset. And then, that's that 2020 draft. Zayde Wisdom's another one. A total pain in the ass player. But you got to have those kind of guys. Right? And that's where you just got to be patient. Send those guys to Lehigh Valley and let them percolate for a couple seasons. That's where Bobby Brink and Attard have to go too.
Yeah,
and Bobby's got a great shot, very, very good to excellent hockey sense. I want to see what it's like at the pro level versus the college level. One of the things, and we've talked about Bobby, is the concern is the skating. But what I think he just needs to improve on is his glide. You'll notice certain players don't move their feet a lot, but they just seem to glide perfectly across the ice at speed. It's really about adding that to his skating ability, because Bobby skates like I did, which isn't great. I dug in too hard. I dug into the ice too hard. So I was too short and too choppy, and I just didn't get enough glide in my stride. I was the opposite of Paul Coffey, basically. And Bobby had a little bit of that. Now it's improved and it's better, but that's where I think he needs to go to the American League and work that out. That's where I want to see Jay O'Brien go to the American League and have him play. Have Adam Jennings come over and play in the American League. Because I think there's enough players in there that they could get to a draft. They could get 2 out of 2018, other than what they already have, O'Brien or Jennings, or maybe Samuel Urson comes in as a backup goaltender. Maybe Wiley plays for them. But if you can get 2 to 3 out of the next 3 drafts of 18, 19, 20, they're in a really good position. But the only way they're going to do that, I think, is going to be increasing their player development staff.
Yeah.
And really spend a lot of resources on those players.
One player, now this speaks to maybe a guy who would have been better off in college, would be Isaac Ratcliffe. He kind of touches all the bases. He had the catastrophic injuries, really bad, at a time when he was just coming on. But this year he's kind of recovered, and he looked better at the NHL level than he has at the AHL level.
Well, it's a little bit less chaotic at the NHL level, and players are where they're supposed to be, 90% of the time comparative to the AHL. So it's easier for those players to come in because everybody around him is reliable for the most part. So that makes it easier. Could he be a fourth liner for you? Sure. But it really depends on what you want to do with your roster construction as well. And that's part of the issue with Wade Allison. It just kills me that this poor kid had so many injuries. And he was coming out in his draft year. I'm like, this kid could be a player. Like I thought at 52nd where they got him was good value. Like his skating wasn't great, but then of course he has like these massive injuries, and he's so far behind his development that I don't know if he'll ever catch up. And it's really unfortunate because he had a lot of skill and talent.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. He just had an injury. He has,
and isn't that a bit of a theme that we've talked about? Like how many of their prospects that are a first or second round have had really bad injuries to the point where it's like ruined their development.
Sam Morin.
Like I honestly haven't seen a franchise like maybe Montreal where they've had so many prospects that have had so many injuries that are so significant at the worst possible time. Like that age of 19 to 22, you don't want any catastrophic injuries. You just can't have them. It's just too hard to come back. I look at Kyle Beach, like in Chicago with his knees, and he just never, he just couldn't recover. It was really unfortunate. And that's what's happened in some cases with Philadelphia. There's some bad luck, but I'm also, how much is that is the American Hockey League and the player development staff and their training staff and having dedicated people specifically in Lehigh that are just dialed into whatever these prospects do. Not just in Lehigh, but the ones that are obviously in college or in the CHL or in Europe as well. Like you need to have player development staff that travels with that to those players as well. Now there's some limitations getting on the ice, but most of the player development guys that I talk to, they say they'd never have any issues. I think the Philadelphia Flyers organization are at a crossroads.
Yeah.
They really are. And this could turn out much better than people realize, and it can turn the corner. In 3 years, this team could be a real dangerous team, or you could be stuck in the mushy middle for a long time. Like a non-playoff team drafting around 10th to 12th to 13th and never really getting any traction and the fans going like nuts. I've never seen Philadelphia fans be apathetic like they have this year. Because I've seen enough games in the old Spectrum when I used to go watch the American League there and then come watch games, and the fans and the Philadelphia fans are bananas.
Yeah.
They're arguably some of the best sports fans I've ever seen. And when they're apathetic, that is a concern to me.
Well, yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, they have been drained because the culture has been kind of sapped out of the organization. I mean, that's something, Hextall did to some degree with his inert activity on the pro side. So, yeah, there's a lot of culprits here. There's no doubt about it. Shane, we're going to have to wrap. I just wanted to give you the opportunity if you wanted to have like a summation, because, I know you had some critics before you go. They maybe some things you wanted to clarify.
Well, I mean, certainly, and I'm not saying that you should do this type of roster construction for every organization. You got to look at it specifically where an organization is in their cycle and then what they have in their farm system. And then when you look at what I was proposing for Philadelphia, the advantages are that it lessens the load for your top end players. So you have 2 second lines and 2 third lines, and then try to have 4 number 3s and 2 number 4s. So you're spreading your cap out more evenly, and that your ice time distribution is more even so that you don't have matchup issues on the road. And then the advantage to that is when you're hunting free agents, you're never going after the big fish. You're always going after second and third liners. You're always going after number 3 and number 4 defensemen. If you're making trades, that's the pool you're swimming in. And then the advantages for drafting and developing is it's easier to find those players. That doesn't mean if that player, if you happen to get a first line player, great. It's a bonus. It's all gravy. But it's easier to find those players. And it's easier to develop those players from that standpoint. So you put more emphasis on the development side for that. And you start accumulating so many of them that you can actually trade those assets away. It's easier to do it that way. And instead of always trying to hit the grand slam home run of yes, you need top end elite players, but they're rare. They're rare. How many, of the roster in Philadelphia, who would you say is an elite player on their roster currently, whether defenseman or forward?
There is none.
There is none.
Right. Carter Hart is the only player who has a chance to be that, and it's probably going to take another couple of years. And maybe.
And in my roster construction, that's what you're going to need is a top end goalie. Like you have to have like a top 10 goalie to make up for some deficiencies in part of the roster. But they don't have that. So I think they're in a really interesting position to say, how do we want to build this organization? Do we want to do the traditional 1 through 4 lines and 1 through 6 defensemen, like the majority of the league, or do we want to do something different in a salary cap era where we're going to be relatively flat for the next couple of years? It'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, no,
because the Philadelphia fans deserve to have a winner, and the league is better when they're in the playoffs. And I love going down to Philadelphia in the playoffs. So I get to hang out with Russ Cohn and the rest of the Philadelphia guys, and go to Philadelphia games. It's great. So
it hasn't been, except for 20, it hasn't been great recently. But so we would be hoping that lottery we get Shane Wright, or are there other players that the Flyers should look at?
Well, they're pretty much. I mean, unless you win the lottery, they're going to be somewhere between that 4 and 7 range for the draft. So if you're looking at that, I'm looking at a list in front of me. Now, none of this is finalized, but you could be looking at Connor Geekie, big centerman playing for Winnipeg in the Western Hockey League. Yuri Slafkovsky, who I happen to think could be a potential really, really good power forward. And power forwards are rare in the NHL. How many are there in the league? Very few. Simon Nemec is another defenseman, Czech defenseman. And if you look at the prospects in Philadelphia's pool, they certainly could use a top-end defenseman. Logan Cooley, another centerman out of the U.S. National Development Programs in that list. Those are probably the main ones that are kind of in there that I would focus on. Matt Savoy probably doesn't quite fit what they're looking for. Maybe David Juracek is another defenseman as a possibility in there, but I suspect unless you win the lottery, they're going to be in 4 to 7, and there's some really good players there. I look at this draft is, other than Wright, I don't know if there's going to be a lot of elite talent, but there's going to be a lot of good second and third line forwards and a lot of good number 3 and number 4 defensemen, and there's going to be more depth in this draft. Not as much high-end talent, but really good depth. So we might get to 60 players that play 200-plus games instead of the historical average of about 56. So it might be more depth. So if Philadelphia can get themselves an extra second-round pick, it probably wouldn't hurt them either.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Shane, thanks so much. Why don't you give people your social media coordinates and tell them any projects that you have coming up?
Well, on Twitter, I'm pretty easy to find them at Shane Malloy, and then our radio show, Hockey Prospect Radio, in our 17th year on Sirius XM NHL Network Radio. We're on Saturday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Then again on Sunday, 8 to 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And projects, gentlemen, I'm in the middle of doing my PhD, so I have a couple more years to battle through that. So if you find me on the side of the road crying, then you'll know how it turned out for me. And just pick me up and take me somewhere nice, because, it's a tough road, but it's fun. It's a really good time. So I have a lot on my plate, but it's great to come and talk about Philadelphia Flyers hockey with you guys. I'd love to do it again anytime.
Appreciate it. Again, as always, Shane, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Chef. Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you. Yep. Thanks, Shane.
That's great.
Take care now.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Okay. Bye now. Okay. So, gents, we went through some of these kids and some of these draft prospects, and in a way, it wouldn't go over real well. But either one of you guys want to chime in? It does seem like now, unless the Flyers are ready to make a splash like they did in 2007, now would be a time to try something like this. The high-end talent, they're going to dig themselves back into the same hole, just like Shane was talking about.
Well, they don't have the money to do that, first of all. I don't think anyway, even if they do manage to move JVR's contract and somewhat, because they'll end up eating a little bit of salary. I think a system like this couldn't hurt to try, but more importantly, I think the gist of what I got out of what Shane was saying, I think more than anything now, they need to have an infrastructure set in the back of the house where they have this support crew from all these draft picks that they got, because they're lining up to probably gather up a couple more in the next couple of years, but it's not going to do anybody good if there isn't, support staff there to help these kids out, eventually on their journey to get to the AHL and NHL. I think it doesn't make sense to me. It's like you plant a garden and you don't put any fertilizer or any water in it, and you expect it. Why didn't I get tomatoes or grapes or what I mean? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, you know what it is, and Dan, you can comment on this. It's like, look at what these organizations, particularly Tampa, did. One of the things, when they have these kids all play together, and they had Ratcliffe and who's the other kid that they Kachuk and Radish, who they traded because they wanted to get Hagel from Chicago. But those kids all came up together, and I think that would be a positive thing. As much as we want to see this player and that player all together, it would be good to get that camaraderie, and it kind of helps the culture along, because culture has been a problem with the Flyers. And to take an intermediate step, like getting some of these other lesser kind of players who are good but not great, to me does seem like a more logical step if we're going to get out of this mindset of a quick turnaround, which I think we all know is probably not really possible.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about it as developmental intelligence, it's something that the Flyers have severely lacked the past number of years. It's just there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason for how they're trying to develop some of these younger players. Yeah. So, when Shane is talking about hiring more development staff and having a better way to develop the kids, that's a good way to think about it. I mean, it doesn't seem like there's any rhyme or reason to what they're doing. And I think that injuries have probably played a large part in it. A lot of these kids, Wade Allison cannot stay healthy. Tyson Forrester has not been able to stay healthy. Zayd Wisdom has not been able to stay healthy. Like, a lot of these kids, that's a big problem. But there's also no rhyme or reason. I mean, look at the way that they've developed Morgan Frost. I mean, he's finally getting a chance to just kind of play in an offensive role. Of course, I saw the lines last night. He's playing with Noah Cates and I don't even remember the other winger, but I don't think it was anything of note. So it's like, what is it? Hodgkin. So yeah, it's like, okay, what are we doing there? I mean, I don't think there's a lot of rhyme or reason to how they try and develop young players. And it's sort of like the Keith Yandel thing, right? Like I don't think any of us would debate the fact that he should have been scratched a long time ago. Like, he's not a very good defenseman, not a very good NHL defenseman anymore, but the timing was just kind of like weird. Like, it's like they're operating like chickens with their heads cut off. They're not really thinking about the long game and what they're doing. And that's what they should be thinking about, but they don't seem to be doing it.
It's kind of like they're behind they're always a step behind, with Yandel, there was like, they really boxed themselves into a corner. I listened to Elliot Friedman today. I think he was right. I think the article by Kevin Kincaid at Crossing Broad hit most of the right notes. I understand why some people, mainly players, might be upset, but they did him a solid, let him break the record and extend it to a certain point. And then listen, at some, you got to move on from there. They had to look at Ronnie Attard, and they saw that York actually played better with Provorov, and Provorov benefited from York, right? And
how weird is that?
Would have been held back had they been dressing Yandel and putting him with Attard. You got to give Attard at least a good look. We know Attard is probably going to at least need a year at the AHL level. They don't want to repeat the mistakes they made with him with Phil Myers, although I think Phil Myers had a pretty extensive time. But there's just so many stories that are below the radar right now with them as they're going through this period. And then some ex-players have, been speaking about the team. Kimmo Timonen more or less said on a podcast he does in Finland, They need to do a rebuild, and that the younger players should be playing right now.
Yeah.
And then Jay Voracek comes out with something about how inflexible that AV was, and the organization's, he's a lot happier with Columbus because of the coach. So obviously there's a problem with AV, but we knew that. There's, it's just Jake articulating something that was no great surprise.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is and I was going to bring it up. I was probably going to be in our closing arguments about Provorov and York. I mean, all three of us have thought he doesn't need to be in that position right now, but actually he's played fairly well these last 2 or 3 games in that role where he's had, and he's actually looked pretty decent. And the scary part is Provorov is kind of feeding off of him. I mean, he does. If you think about it, it's kind of weird. I found myself weird saying it, that he has that calming presence that Provorov needed. We all said it. He looked like he, when he's out there, he's not making stupid decisions. He's smooth. He doesn't panic with the puck. And I guess all of his other, all of his other partners have kind of like been the opposite of what Cam York has been for him anyway, save maybe Justin Braun. But the other point, I think Dan had the best description for that, but I also would add to his points was they're being reactive instead of being proactive. Right. To me, it doesn't. To me, there means you can hire all the guys we want. I don't even know if there's a game plan. There's no 2-point. Show me what you're going to do to get to points 3, 4, and 5, and then we'll talk about 5, 6, and 7 after conditional. Like if we get to this point, I don't even know. You can hire all the people you want, but if you don't have a game plan in place, it's still going to be a mess.
Yeah, I think they are kind of flying by the seat of their pants, reactive. That's an excellent way to put it. That's where they're at right now. I would like them in the offseason to sweep all that clean. And if that means that Fletcher doesn't make it and Dave Scott says, you know what, I think we're kidding ourselves here. And some of these evaluations lead to that conclusion. The Flyers will probably be better off. Whatever it takes to stop this quick turnaround with just a few moves away nonsense. And with that, let me give Dan, I know you got to get rolling, give you the last word and give us your social media coordinates and things like that.
I've really enjoyed watching Morgan Frost play with a lot more confidence the last few weeks. I think that there was a lot of debate about him, and I certainly don't think that he's I don't think I'd say for sure that he's going to be a second line NHL scorer, but I just think that it goes to show you the way that he's been playing the last few weeks, where he's had the puck on his stick a lot more often. He's making plays. It just kind of goes to show you, I think there's a lot of impatience among this fan base when it comes to young kids. And I've just been happy to see the way that he's been playing. And, Owen Tippett, the same thing, because a lot of Florida fans felt about Owen Tippett like Flyers fans have felt about Morgan Frost. So anyway, those are the kinds of things I'm looking forward to keeping track of the rest of the season, kind of seeing how some of these young kids perform. And yeah, we'll see and go from there. But fans can follow me on Twitter at dsilver88, and hopefully it's an entertaining rest of the year at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Chef?
Yeah, you can find me at Chef to the Left B on Twitter, and I'll just reinforce what Dan said. I mean, Morgan Frost has been a pleasure to watch. I mean, I'm like, look, like Shane said, the apathy that has settled into the Philadelphia Flyer fan is probably one of the worst things in sports right now. It could be the main story on a lot of feeds, but watching him being as strong as he is on the puck now and forechecking, the kid is like a forechecking machine all of a sudden. He's creating turnovers in the offensive zone, which I like. And that it seemed like he took whatever people had criticized him about on his game and actually took, issue with it and corrected it. So good for him. So I'm going to continue watching the rest of the games of the season. maybe not live, maybe taping them and skipping through the commercials and stuff like that. But I will be watching them to see who develops and who doesn't. And on that note, Farabee is looking to be a very good leader on this team and possibly a decent center too.
Yeah, I don't think Farabee's a center, to be honest with you, but I think he's too pass happy right now. Passed up a lot of shots. I don't know, but I think they should go get a center, but maybe there was one in house. Maybe Shane's right. They should just come back with Couturier, Lawton, and Hayes and go from there. Okay. All right. Yeah, you can follow me, Isaiah, at Isaiah, SAIAH _520. Isaiah, don't forget the _520. Before we go, I mentioned earlier, Elliot Friedman talked about the Flyers are definitely interested in someone like Nazem Kadri, like we talked about earlier. I think that's a big mistake. So we'll have to see. So until next time, everybody, thanks for listening and take care.